Hi, Tracy, it's Brett. Do we have a quorum? Are we ready to get started?
Yes, we do have quorum.
All right, thank you. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order of the September 2nd MPO Tech Committee. Looking for a motion to approve the agenda.
Sturm, so moved.
Second, Huesman.
All right, it's been moved and seconded and to approve the agenda. Any further discussion? Anybody opposed to the motion? The agenda is approved. Next up is approval of the meeting minutes from the August 5th, 2021 Technical Committee meeting. Is there a motion to approve?
I move to approve, Miller.
Second, Huesman.
All right, it's been moved and seconded to approve the meeting minutes of the August 5th meeting. Any further discussion? Anyone opposed to the motion? All right, that motion carries and the meeting minutes are approved. Next up is a presentation from Pleasant Hill for their ADA transition plan. Dylan.
Yeah, I'll introduce this real quick. So we've talked before to this committee, providing some resources and so forth on ADA transition plans and what's required of them and examples and things like that. And a couple of years ago, Madeline offered that because Pleasant Hill had just completed theirs, that she'd be happy to present on it. That happened, I think, in 2019. We planned for it in early 2020. Pandemic happened and it just kind of got lost in the shuffle. So finally bringing that back to allow Madeline to share what's been done. And hopefully that's of value to those of you that have to do these plans and just give you a little more background on what's required and that kind of thing. So with all that said, I'll turn it over to Madeline.
Great, thanks, Dylan. As Dylan mentioned, our plan was actually adopted originally in 2018. So this is a little bit old, but I can give some context and updates on what we have done since then and how we are implementing it. So you can go ahead to the next slide. This presentation was originally given at the American Planning Association conference in 2019. So I've just tried to pare it down to the things that are relevant for this group. So as many of you, most of you know, American with Disabilities Act requires cities to adopt an ADA transition plan, and they do provide guidance per Federal Highway Association on what needs to be included in that ADA transition plan. So you can see in that yellow panel there on the right how that is being identified to identify physical barriers, describe methods to make facilities accessible, setting up a schedule, identifying a local committee responsible for implementation, estimating costs, incorporating public input, and then tracking your progress towards completion. Prior to the ADA transition plan happening, just a little bit of context of what was happening in Pleasant Hill at the moment is we had adopted our comprehensive plan in 2015, and many of the components and goals and objectives included in that comprehensive plan were moving towards an attitude of walkability. One of the things that we had intentionally done, this was going alongside when the MPO was adopting or updating their Complete Streets model ordinance. And so we intentionally waited to adopt the Complete Streets ordinance until right after the comprehensive plan was adopted, which was a recommendation for a kind of quick win that we were able to point back to having that walkability component and feature in our community. We also were able to capitalize on a council member who his neighborhood by covenant requires 6-foot wide sidewalks. And so we made a change that all new sidewalks constructed in the city of Pleasant Hill are required to be 6 feet in width. We had a couple of new trail improvements. And so we hired a consultant to help us with the ADA transition plan and then also a corridor crossing study. So University Avenue is our biggest pedestrian barrier within our community. And so we wanted to look at it from a closer lens of how we can safely get pedestrians across University Avenue to traverse our community. So we hired Alta Planning and Design to do our ADA transition plan and corridor crossing study together to help us with this process. So these two planning documents kind of worked side by side as they moved forward into implementation. So you can go ahead to the next slide. So a little bit of context that was helpful for us and helpful for our understanding moving forward is who the transition plan was going to be impacting, and recognizing that we had individuals in our community that had disabilities and had needs that would be that would be utilized as we were making these changes. We also had a lot of anecdotal data and information of people that you would see using a motorized wheelchair to cross University Avenue to get to a medical clinic across the street. So we knew that it was an issue in our community today, that there were transportation barriers and accessibility barriers preventing people from safely being able to traverse through our community. You can go ahead to the next slide. So as I'm sure you are aware, it's required of agencies with more than 50 employees. And just because you have a plan does not mean that you need to fix all of the, just because you're identifying what the issues are, you do not have to immediately address all of those issues. The plan is in place to help you identify those issues and then put together a plan of how you're going to address those issues moving forward. And that really protects you from a legal perspective. So if something were to occur, or if someone were to bring up a concern, you can identify how you are making progress towards addressing those issues and concerns that are throughout your community. You can go ahead to the next slide. And one of the things that was really impactful, a couple of things that were really impactful for me through this process was understanding that this actually was much more beneficial for individuals. It's beyond individuals with disabilities, that we will all need assistance at some point in our lives, whether you, have had a knee replacement surgery or you broke a leg, or you're, that there's always going to be an occasion where you could take advantage of having more accommodations within the public realm to help you traverse through your community. And so you can see here that, individuals with vision or hearing impairments have the same sort of sight lines as children. And so it's planning for beyond just what your traditional disability accommodations would be, but also for all age ranges and all abilities to help them be able to be comfortable in your community. You can go ahead to the next slide. And one of the other things that was important was that, SUDAS addresses street design by vehicle type, and we all have adopted SUDAS. That's what we use to help design the streets within our community, but there is not that similar type of design guide to the technical level that helps for pedestrians. And so this was helpful in understanding how people use your sidewalks and trails and the space that they really take up. And we did a workshop that I'll talk about next, but we demonstrated, had people walk side by side holding a hula hoop around them. So it was like a 5-foot wide hula hoop, and understanding that that's really what people's comfort level, like your comfort bubble between people as you're walking down the sidewalk. And so to understand if you're going to have to walk side by side, how much space you need to be able to comfortably pass someone, or even have two people walking side by side together, if you're walking with a stroller, if you're walking a dog, if you're running, and the types of space and accommodations that are needed to do all of those different activities. And so you can start to see, farther down on that chart that you get, that the more sidewalk is needed in order to make that a comfortable experience. And so that was really helpful and affirming for us of the importance of having that 6-foot wide sidewalk ordinance in place. You can go ahead to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the process that we went through, we hired a consultant, ADA planning and design, to do this. They specialize in transportation or pedestrian transportation, which is why we were looking at them to come in and do this for us. They held a 2-day workshop where we had individuals from Public Works, our building inspectors, our plan review staff, our planning staff, our city manager, anyone, our park staff, anyone that's involved with the sidewalk components of our community, from planning and looking at them, on a piece of paper, all the way to public works crews who are making replacements in the field. So they all participated in this so that we had a common understanding of why this was important, and giving people a place to ask questions and make sure that we were working towards the same goals. So through that, we worked with reviewing our existing specifications and reviewing our existing policies that we had in place for subdivision practices or new construction, right of way, any of those things that may be potentially helping or hurting accessibility, even things that were practices in place, like our sidewalk inspection policy that we had by this is just what we did. We formalized that into an actual policy to be able to say that this is how we inspect our sidewalks and what our sidewalk program is. And then we're able to document that, include that within our plan. So we also did field reviews of recent projects that were completed. We went out into the field and had everyone go down our sidewalks with a wheelchair. We had low vision goggles that we had people walking and just using our accommodations as if you were that person with a disability, so that you can really understand what it would be like to be in that situation and how uncomfortable it is. Just a small change in grade and what that does to how difficult it is to move a wheelchair. We also crossed University Avenue at the one intersection that we have that has pedestrian accommodation, so that you could feel how uncomfortable that experience is for someone to be crossing that high traffic corridor. Even though there are pedestrian accommodations, that it's just still not a comfortable experience. So we reviewed different areas of ADA responsibilities. So as many of you also have in your communities, not all of our roadways are our own. We share responsibility with the county or with the DOT. And so making sure that we understood whose responsibility those things were, and then reviewing how it happens in practice. So during active construction, making sure that you're providing alternate routes for accessible routes for individuals to use, what happens during maintenance, what happens during snow removal, and that you're not creating additional impediments during other times of the year. And go ahead to the next slide. So then we talked about the ADA impacts as it happens through our community. So how does it happen with new construction and adding alterations, maintenance, and how are those impacted? And as it notes here that routine maintenance doesn't trigger ADA, but the facilities have to be maintained in order to remain accessible throughout a maintenance project. And then documentation of exceptions. And so this one was really important for us to understand, as our community has some topography challenges, that making sure that we all understood that there is a point where you don't have to meet ADA, you just need to be able to submit it or document the exception of everything that you tried and the process that you went through to get there. So we had next to one of our elementary schools an area where we tried as much as we could as a maintenance project to meet ADA. We did the best we could. We repaved the sidewalk 15 feet back and met the running slope of the roadway. But if it was a new construction project, wouldn't have met the existing or the current ADA standards that were in place. All right, you can go ahead to the next slide. And then a big part of the plan creation was data collection. So we actually hired an intern to help with the data collection. So someone went out into the field who physically cataloged every sidewalk, curb ramp, crosswalk, driveway, and pedestrian push button throughout the community to identify and collect that data on if they met standards or not, and where they fell in that process. So you can go ahead to the next slide. So you can see in that chart on the right, that is all of the data that was collected at each of those points. And so it was incredibly time consuming to be able to collect this information. But once we had it, then it was used and is still used for us to continue to update. So many information points that needed to be collected. You could go ahead to the next slide. So then that data was then used and put into this format. So you can see we have almost 600 at the time that this was done. So this was several years ago. We had almost 600 curb ramps, and then it was identified, priority streets were identified. And so this was based on if there were public facilities or schools or users that needed higher access and by the street classification. So of those 600 curb ramps, 209 of them were on priority streets. And then you can go ahead to the next slide. And so then you can see of those 600 curb ramps, there were 470 of them that had deficient features. And then major deficiencies on those priority streets was 170. And so that starts by categorizing it by the priority streets. It started to make it a little bit more attainable for us to be able to address. You can go ahead to the next slide. So then this is just a map of how that information was cataloged or is displayed. So you can see the blue is the priority streets, yellow is the other streets where all of the curb ramps are identified in our community. And then the next slide is a map then of cataloging the actual condition of those and whether they would need replacement or repair or whatever. So actual locations of where those places are. So then on the next slide, it's similar thing for sidewalks. So sidewalks on priority streets or other streets. So went through with all of that data that we collected and were able to create these maps to really help us hone in and identify where the issues were in our community. So you can go ahead to the next slide. So again, we prioritize them. Priority streets were based on the functional classification, and this was able to help us target the improvements that we actually needed to do or to make happen. And then the next slide shows the darker spots here show the priority areas of the deficient or poor quality ramps and other infrastructure and where we really need to identify it. So you can see here, this starts to identify that it's located near a trail or a school, or it's a priority corridor that needs to be addressed. And then the next slide, as a part of the process, you also have to do public participation. And so put it out to the individuals in our community who had who may have needs, and so received that feedback, and that was incorporated into the plan of how we were going to address those things. So you can see a couple of comments here from the public and how those were identified and incorporated into our plan. Go ahead to the next slide. One of the other requirements is creating a committee of how you are going to address if someone brings forward a complaint or an issue, and how those issues would get addressed. And so we had to establish a committee that was made up of our city clerk, our public works director, community development director, parks and rec director, and residents that are living with disabilities, so that that would be the committee that would help address any of the grievances that would be brought forward to meet with the standards or the requirements of our plan. You can go ahead to the next slide. So the consultant then worked with us on the standard price that it would cost at the time of how much it would be to address all of those issues throughout our community. So they put and had standards of, a sidewalk replacement, or is this a curb replacement, is this or curb ramp, etc. And so then being able to put an estimated cost to all of those features that needed improvement throughout our community. So some big numbers there, but to help us help us with being able to identify funding to address all of those issues. And then if you go ahead to the next slide, this starts to bring it down to a little bit more of a manageable project. So curb ramp replacement between $300 and $3,500 to do that. So if we were to replace them on just the priority streets, you can see the estimated cost there if we were to do it on all streets. So then we identified as a community that we were going to have an annual commitment of $50,000 to start addressing our ADA needs throughout our community. So annually we budget that amount in our CIP program. for projects, and we have been pairing it right now with our annual street patching replacement program that has worked really well. So as we are doing street patching throughout the community, we are addressing any of the accessibility issues that are identified from the mapping that we have done in that area. So are kind of taking off those small chunks, but just making sure, so it's able to expand our street patching project a little bit by making the scope a little bit bigger, and also accomplishing those other projects that meet our ADA plan, so that we can show that we are making progress towards it. And then the next slide there, so continuing to maintain that database. So at the end of every year, then we update our plan to not only update the like the street patching projects that we have done, but any new house that's constructed or any new subdivision where they're adding curb ramps, adding sidewalks. So we are able to use that information to update our plan to show how we're making progress towards accomplishing the goals of the ADA plan. So go ahead to the next slide. I guess I already talked about, so we're using it as a part of our street patching project. So we, if there is a panel that we are replacing that is going to touch a curb ramp, that's kind of our internal policy that we use on whether or not we're going to replace it or not, and include it in the project, or if there's any in the area. But that's kind of the threshold that we have been using that's been helpful to make those accommodations. And then after we adopted the plan, you can go ahead to the next slide. After we adopted the plan, we tried to set a good example. So right out front of City Hall, we had a major deficiency of our ADA plan, and it was on a high priority corridor because it's immediately adjacent to all city facilities. And so with that first round of street patching, we had the contractor update the accessibility features in front of City Hall. So we fixed our own ADA issues right away. So we were able to add some trail and do the work with some adjacent property owner as well, actually, to fill in some trail, but just trying to lead by example and show that we were committed to making the improvements in our community. So that is the information that I have. So we approved a contract with Alta in February of 2017. We did the final acceptance of the plan in August of 2018. So it took us about 18 months. It took us much longer because we realized we were not getting all of the data collected on our own before we went out and hired someone else to help us with that. So it doesn't necessarily need to take that long if you have staff that is able to dedicate time to collecting that data. And we paid, it was about $85,000 is what we paid for the plan. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have or provide some additional context or information. Dylan included a copy of our plan is on our website that was linked in the packet, but happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
All right, any questions for Madeline? If not, Madeline, thanks very much for sharing that information. I appreciate it. We'll move on to the next item, which is a report and vote on the federal fiscal year 2022 to 2025 program tip amendment. Shreyoshi.
Yes, thank you. So we have a few tip amendments today for your consideration, and the first one here before you is from the city of Des Moines for their project on Southwest 9th Street, and it's a bridge replacement project over the Middle South Creek. So this is a project that received new highway bridge program funding, and therefore the city is requesting that we add the project to the tip. We support the amendment request, and if you have any questions, I will be happy to take them at this time. Otherwise, we are just seeking your approval to go ahead and add this project to the 2022 through 2025 Transportation Improvement Program. Thank you.
All right, looking for a motion to approve the Southwest 9th tip amendment.
Motion
so
to
moved.
second, Davis.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Anyone opposed to the motion? All right, that action carries. Next up is another tip amendment, this one for the Carlisle Trail connection.
Yes, as you said, this is the second tip amendment request. This is also from the city of Des Moines for their Carlisle Trail connection project. This project involves construction of a new trail section, which is between the Easter Lake spine trail at the southern limit of the city of Des Moines and connecting it to the existing city of Carlisle Trail. So this project has received STBG set aside or TAP funding before. They have now received some additional federal recreational trail funding, additional funding for this project as well, which is about 400,000. So the city is essentially requesting that we update the project and add this new funding that they have secured for this particular project. So we support the tip amendment request. And if you have any questions, I can answer them at this time. Otherwise, we're seeking your approval to update the funding information for this particular project. Thank you.
All right, do we have a motion and a second for this?
Burgesser moved.
Second, Bill.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Anyone opposed to the motion? All right, motion carries. Next up is another tip amendment, this one for phase 1 dam mitigation.
Yes, so this tip amendment is from the Des Moines MPO and involves updating some information regarding the description of this particular project. This is the Water Trails project and has received build grant funding. When the project received funding a couple years ago, we added information into the TPMS and the tracking system and the tip with whatever information was available at that time, which was a little bit more generic. At this point, we have some additional details that have been fleshed out, such as specific locations where the projects are happening at Prospect Park, Birdland Park, Scott Avenue Dam, and Harriet Access. So we want to go into the DOT's TPMS tracking system and update that information to reflect that. And therefore, we are seeking a tip amendment in order to go ahead and update that information within the tip. So that's essentially what the amendment request is. If you have any questions about it, I'll be happy to take them. Otherwise, again, seeking your approval to go ahead and process this amendment. Thanks.
All right, do we have a motion for this?
Motion to approve, Huesman.
Second, John Dostart.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Anyone opposed to the motion? All right, that motion carries. Thanks. Next up is a report and vote on the federal fiscal year 2023 Iowa Clean Air Attainment Program applications. Dylan.
Thank you. We solicited project applications back in July. They were due July 23rd. We received the ones that were listed there on the screen. There's also a copy of that list in the agenda packet on page 10. The process here is that we review these to make sure that they're compliant with the long-range transportation plan, which they are, after which we provide resolutions of support to those project sponsors for them to submit those applications in by the due date. So what we're asking for today is just approval of these projects so that we can provide those resolutions that we're in support of them and that they do, comply with the long range plan. And then we'll send those to the project sponsors. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Sturm, so moved.
Burgesser second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or questions? Anyone opposed to the motion? All right, that motion carries. Next up is a report on the Central Iowa Climate Toolbox. Allison. You're still on mute, Allison.
Would it be a Zoom meeting if I didn't unmute myself? Okay, so good morning, everyone. I just want to run through the climate toolbox with you all that we released today. You can go to the next slide, Gunnar. So we all know that the recurring extremes keep happening every year, sometimes twice or 3 times a year throughout central Iowa. But also on the flip side, there's opportunities for action. So more funding programs are opening up to climate adaptation and resilience. More projects are coming online. And so the MPO wanted to get ahead of this and start putting climate data in a usable form in front of you all. The US EPA did a climate change adaptation and resilience report and found that there's a number of ways that we as the MPO can assist you, and that's formatting and distributing the climate data that you might not be super familiar with in a more usable fashion, which the toolbox is aiming to do, increasing the skill sets that planners have. I'm here as a resource if that ever comes up, and then integrating this into hazard mitigation and comprehensive land use planning. So on the next slide, you'll see that these are the main pieces that are in the climate toolbox right now. We run through some of the climate planning foundations, provide climate assessments at the national, state and regional level. We run through some data and then some projections as well, outline some of the hazard risk and vulnerabilities that are in the region, and then actually walk people through how to conduct a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. The later 2 pages look into strategies of how to incorporate this into city projects. When we get into the adaptation, we specifically look at the Iowa Smart Planning principles that are in the Iowa State Code and really look at how planners and cities can incorporate adaptation into comprehensive planning. So it's not a whole nother set of planning processes and documents as well. And so we put this out. It will, you can go to the next slide. It will continue to evolve as this topic continues to evolve. Today, with the rest of my day, I'll be finishing up organizing some of the funding resources that are already out there and organizing the case studies and spotlights of other Midwestern cities that are utilizing some of these resources, as well as have kind of gone down these pathways before, so we can learn from them as well. So officially last night, it became a piece of our website. It is under the regional initiatives tab on our website, and you can also find it at that website right there. I will put a link in the chat. This is something for you all to use. I am here as a resource, so if there's something that you'd like to see added or anything you need, please do reach out to me and I'd be happy to make adjustments, connect you with data points or technical assistance as you need it. So with that, feel free to review, reach out to me, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have at this time.
All right, thanks, Allison. Any questions for her at this time? Okay, before we move on to the next one, I know that Mike Ludwig put something in the chat regarding a typo on number 7. Mike, you want to bring that up?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't unmute in time before the vote. Item 7 under the total project amount was listed at 480,000. I think it should be 48 million. Otherwise, we have quite a bit of extra federal aid.
Yeah, Mike, I noticed that as well, and we'll get that fixed moving forward.
Okay. All right. Thanks a bunch.
Thanks, Mike. Next up, we'll stay with Allison, and she's going to give us a report on the FEMA hazard mitigation grant funding.
Yep. So one of those funding opportunities, oh, you can go up one slide. There you go. So FEMA has released 2 NOFAs recently. The usual is the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program that many of you are already familiar with. That application is going to be due December 30th of this year. You can go to the next one. And then one that you might not be as familiar with is the BRIC, so Building Resilient Infrastructures and Communities. It used to be the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program. They have repackaged it and added a few things, especially here, and you can get help for this in the toolbox, is climate resilience and adaptation plans, and actions are built in there as well. And so some of those key data points will be useful there. Still a lot of the same pieces, lifelines, buildings, things like that, incorporating those nature-based solutions. Again, this application will be due at the same time as the last one, December 30th of this year. And then on the next slide, FEMA also has granted the state of Iowa a hazard mitigation grant program funding as part of the disaster declaration for COVID. The details on this are still pretty loose, but the application is pretty far out, June 30, 2022. And so because of the newness of BRIC and this presidential disaster declaration, we have invited FEMA and Iowa Homeland Security staff to present on these programs at our Council of WMA's meeting on November 8th at 2 p.m. If you're not on that contact list, by all means, please do reach out to me. We'd be happy to have you come in for that meeting and hear what FEMA has to say on this as we kind of reacquaint ourselves with some of the nuances in these new programs. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them at this time.
All right, any questions for Allison? All right, thanks, Allison. Next up is a report on upcoming events. Gunnar.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, everyone. Run through a few events for your interest and awareness. We told you about this last time, I believe, but we still have today to collect public comment on a draft comprehensive economic development strategy for the economic development district being formed. Link on the screen here. We will, of course, send an email out after today's meeting with relevant links from our conversation today. I also want to draw your attention to a streets and roads workshop coming up here later this month, the 21st and 23rd through the 23rd in Ames. Bike Month has some more details for you and updated links as the events for the month have been refined. Also want to make sure you have in your calendars the upcoming annual conference for APA Iowa being held in Des Moines this year. Also in October is the iStorm virtual conference. I will also note that there's a special session for local leaders as part of that coming up later in late October. And that's it from events.
All right, thanks, Gunnar. Any questions for him? All right, any other non-action item of interest to the committee? All right, hearing none, our next meeting date is October 7th, 2021. Thank you, everyone. We are adjourned.